Imagine a young lawyer standing in a packed courtroom in 1953, bloodied from a failed uprising, facing a judge who holds his life in his hands. He doesn't beg for mercy. Instead, he delivers a 4-hour fiery speech that ends with words that would echo through history. "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." That man was Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz, and what began as a revolutionary dream to free Cuba from dictatorship would, over the next 5 decades, transform him into the very thing he once fought against, a ruler who held power longer than any other leader in the modern Western Hemisphere. This is the epic story of how a Cuban revolutionary became a dictator for life. Fidel Castro's rise, his reign, and the complicated legacy he left behind. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in the small rural town of Birán in Oriente Province, Cuba, not into poverty, but into a world of stark contrasts. His father, Ángel Castro y Argis, was a wealthy Spanish immigrant from Galicia who owned a sprawling sugar plantation and employed hundreds of workers. His mother, Lina Ruz González, was a poor Canarian servant in Angel's household. Fidel was born out of wedlock, one of 7 children the couple would eventually have together after Angel's first marriage fell apart. Young Fidel grew up surrounded by the sugarcane fields and the hardscrabble lives of the peasant laborers who toiled for his father. At age 6, he was sent to live with a teacher in Santiago de Cuba to begin his education, and at 8 he was baptized Catholic so he could attend the prestigious La Salle boarding school. Later, he moved to the Jesuit-run Colegio de Dolores and then to the elite Colegio de Belén in Havana, where he excelled in sports like basketball and baseball, but chafed under strict discipline. Those Jesuit priests instilled in him a sense of discipline and oratory skill that would serve him well, but they also exposed him to the vast inequalities of Cuban society under the shadow of American influence. By 1945, at age 19, Castro enrolled in law school at the University of Havana. It was here that his political awakening truly ignited. The campus was a hotbed of student activism, gangsterismo, violent turf wars between rival political gangs, and fervent anti-imperialism. Cuba was nominally independent since 1902, but the Platt Amendment had allowed the United States to intervene repeatedly, and American companies dominated the sugar economy. Castro threw himself into protests against corruption under President Ramón Grau San Martín. In November 1946, he delivered a blistering public speech condemning government violence and graft that made front-page news. He joined the newly formed Partido Ortodoxo, inspired by the fiery reformer Eduardo Chibas, and ran unsuccessfully for president of the Federation of University Students. In 1947, he even joined a doomed expedition to overthrow the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, though it was halted by the Cuban government under U.S. pressure. Then came the pivotal moment in April 1948. Castro traveled to Bogotá, Colombia, as part of a student delegation. When liberal leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was assassinated, riots erupted, El Bogotazo. Castro grabbed a rifle from a police station amid the chaos, joined the crowds, and later reflected in a 2009 interview, "I joined the people. I witnessed the spectacle of a totally spontaneous revolution. My still incipient Marxist ideas had nothing to do with our conduct. It was a spontaneous reaction, as young people with Martian, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and pro-democratic ideas." Martí, Cuba's poet-revolutionary hero, became his lifelong idol. Back in Cuba, Castro married Mirta Díaz Balart in October 1948, a union that briefly exposed him to the island's elite circles through her wealthy family. Their son, Fidelito, was born in 1949. He graduated with a law degree in 1950 and opened a small practice defending the poor, but it struggled financially. Bills piled up. Furniture was repossessed. Politically, he campaigned for Congress under the Ortodoxo banner, focusing on the urban poor. But on March 10, 1952, everything changed. General Fulgencio Batista, who had ruled as a strong man before, staged a military coup, canceling elections and suspending the constitution. For Castro, this was the final straw. Peaceful politics were dead. He began organizing a revolutionary movement in secret, recruiting from Havana's slums and naming it the Movement. By early 1953, he had stockpiled weapons and trained about 165 young idealists, many of them students and workers. On July 26, 1953, now celebrated as the revolution's official start, Castro led the audacious attack on the Moncada Barracks in Santiago de Cuba, Cuba's second-largest military fortress. The plan was bold, but flawed. Seize the barracks at dawn, arm the people, and spark a nationwide uprising. Disguised in stolen army uniforms, the rebels struck at 5:15 a.m., but chaos ensued. Half the force got lost, coordination failed, and Batista's troops overwhelmed them. Dozens of rebels were killed in the fighting or executed afterward. Castro and a handful escaped into the nearby mountains. Captured days later, he faced trial. In his now legendary defense speech on October 16, 1953, broadcast live and later published as History Will Absolve Me, Castro turned the courtroom into a platform. He outlined 5 revolutionary laws he would have enacted: land reform, profit sharing for workers, education for all, and lambasted Batista's regime as unconstitutional. He declared the attack justified under Cuba's own 1940 constitution and ended with that immortal line, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Sentenced to 15 years, he was sent to the Isle of Pines prison, where he read voraciously. Marx, Lenin, Martí, even Freud, organized study groups among inmates, and wrote letters rallying supporters. Public pressure led to his release in a 1955 amnesty after just 22 months. Divorced from Mirta by then, he wasted no time. "I am leaving Cuba because all doors of peaceful struggle have been closed to me," he wrote. Exiled to Mexico, he reformed the group as the 26th of July movement, trained with a Spanish Civil War veteran named Alberto Bayo, and recruited key allies, his brother, Raúl, and crucially, an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, whom he met in 1955. Guevara, already a committed Marxist, became his right-hand man. On November 25, 1956, Castro and 81 others crammed aboard a leaky yacht called the Granma and set sail from Tuxpan, Mexico, for Cuba. The voyage was hellish, overcrowded, stormy, seasick revolutionaries vomiting over the rails. They landed 2 days late on Playa Las Coloradas in Oriente province. Batista's forces were waiting. Ambushed, the rebels scattered. Only about 19 survivors, including Fidel, Raúl, and Che, made it to the rugged Sierra Maestra mountains. It was a near-suicidal low point. But from those misty peaks, Castro rebuilt. They lived off the land, won over local peasants with promises of land reform, and launched hit-and-run raids. Castro established Radio Rebelde to broadcast messages across the island, turning the mountains into a revolutionary beacon. By early 1957, his forces had grown to hundreds. They executed a brutal plantation overseer in front of villagers to show justice for the poor. Urban allies in Havana supplied arms and intelligence. Key victories followed: the Battle of La Plata in January 1957, ambushes that humiliated Batista's army. In 1958, Batista launched Operation Verano, a massive offensive with 10,000 troops, but the guerrillas used the terrain masterfully, laying mines, setting traps, and melting into the jungle. Defections mounted. By late 1958, Castro's columns, led by him, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos, controlled vast swaths of eastern Cuba. A general strike paralyzed the country. On New Year's Eve, 1958, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic with a fortune in stolen cash. On January 1, 1959, Castro's rebels marched triumphantly into Santiago. By January 8th, Fidel entered Havana to delirious crowds lining the streets. The dictator was gone. The revolution had won.
But victory was only the beginning. Castro, now 32, became the de facto leader, first as commander of the armed forces, then prime minister in February 1959. He promised a new Cuba: honest government, land for the peasants, education and health for all. Early moves were popular, slashing rents, seizing mafia-run casinos, trying and executing hundreds of Batista's torturers and killers in public trials. "We are executing murderers," Castro told crowds in 1959. "Revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction." He nationalized U.S.-owned sugar plantations and oil refineries under the 1959 Agrarian Reform Law, redistributing land to peasants. When the U.S. cut sugar quotas in retaliation, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for trade deals. Relations with Washington soured fast. In 1960, he nationalized more American assets. By 1961, diplomatic ties were severed. That April, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, 1,400 Cuban exiles landing at Playa Girón, aimed to topple him. Castro personally directed the defense from the front lines. In 3 days, the invaders were crushed. Over 1,000 surrendered. In a May Day speech afterward, he declared Cuba socialist for the first time. "The imperialists cannot forgive us. We are building socialism." As he later told interviewer Robert McNeil in 1985, after the Bay of Pigs, Cuba and the Soviet Union feared additional attempts by the U.S. to invade. "It wasn't us, it was the United States that initiated the blockade, the invasion, the sabotage." The peak of Castro's power and its darkest controversies came in the 1960s. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war when Soviet missiles were placed on the island. From Castro's perspective, shared in that same 1985 interview, it was defensive. "The U.S. had blockaded us. We answered correctly." Khrushchev removed the missiles after secret deals with Kennedy, leaving Castro furious at being sidelined. Domestically, he consolidated absolute control. He dissolved rival revolutionary groups, banned opposition parties, and declared the revolution's goal was not elections but transformation. Literacy brigades fanned out across the countryside in 1961, raising literacy from 60% to nearly 100% in a year. Rural clinics and schools sprouted everywhere. Infant mortality plummeted. Cuban doctors became a global export. Internationally, Castro positioned himself as a champion of the Third World, sending troops to Angola in 1975 to fight apartheid South Africa and backing liberation movements in Africa and Latin America. Che Guevara's image, immortalized after his 1967 death in Bolivia, became the revolution's face. But behind triumphs lurked repression. Thousands of political opponents, former allies who criticized communist influence, homosexuals, religious leaders, and intellectuals were imprisoned in camps like the UMAP labor camps or executed at La Cabaña fortress under Che's early oversight. Media was censored. Only the state newspaper Granma survived. Elections were promised, but never held. As Tad Sulk detailed in his 1986 biography, Fidel, A Critical Portrait, based on extensive interviews with Castro, the leader viewed dissent as counter-revolutionary treason that threatened the socialist experiment. By the mid-1960s, Cuba was a one-party state under the Communist Party, which Castro headed. His personal life remained enigmatic, married briefly to Dalia Sota del Valle in the 1960s, fathering 5 more sons while keeping other affairs private, but power was centralized in him and his inner circle, including brother Raúl. The 1970s and 1980s saw Castro at his most influential abroad, yet facing economic strain at home. The Soviet subsidy kept the lights on, but inefficiency plagued state farms. The 1980 Mario boat lift saw 125,000 Cubans flee, many labeled undesirables by the regime. In public speeches, Castro framed emigration as betrayal by those corrupted by imperialism. Health and education remained beacons. Life expectancy rivaled Europe's, but rationing and shortages were constant. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union triggered the Special Period, a devastating economic crisis. Oil imports vanished, factories shut, food riots loomed. Castro legalized limited private enterprise and tourism, admitting in speeches, "We have to adapt to that reality of the world." He forged new alliances with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, trading Cuban doctors for oil. Despite illness, rumors of cancer or Parkinson's, he remained defiant, railing against the U.S. embargo in marathon addresses that could last hours. In 2006, intestinal surgery forced him to hand day-to-day power to Raúl. On February 19, 2008, he formally resigned as president after 49 years, writing in Granma that he would not seek re-election. "My health is not good," he acknowledged. He lived on as an elder statesman, writing columns until his death on November 25, 2016, at age 90. Millions mourned in Havana. His ashes were interred in Santiago. Fidel Castro's legacy is as polarizing as the man himself. To supporters and millions of Cubans and leftists worldwide, he was the liberator who ended Yankee domination, achieved universal literacy and healthcare that outshone much of Latin America, and inspired anti-colonial struggles from Vietnam to South Africa. Cuba stood sovereign, sending doctors to disasters globally even today. As he once said in a 1959 interview, "I am not interested in power. All that I will do is to make sure that the sacrifices of so many compatriots should not be in vain." Yet critics, drawing from human rights archives and exile testimonies, paint a darker picture. A dictator who ruled without elections, imprisoned or exiled hundreds of thousands of dissidents, executed thousands in the revolution's early years, and presided over an economy that stagnated for decades. The Guardian and Human Rights Watch documented systematic surveillance, censorship, and the stifling of free speech. Cuba's GDP per capita lagged behind neighbors. The special period exposed the fragility of Soviet dependence. Books like Sulc's and news archives from the era reveal how the idealistic revolutionary gradually justified one-party rule as necessary for survival against U.S. hostility. The lesson? Revolutions born in hope can harden into authoritarianism when power becomes absolute. Idealism clashes with pragmatism. The fight against one tyrant can birth another. Fidel Castro didn't just change Cuba. He embodied the 20th century's great ideological battles: capitalism versus socialism, empire versus independence. History may not have fully absolved him, but it will debate him for generations. In the end, the boy from Birán who dreamed of justice became a giant whose shadow still looms over the island he transformed forever. What do you think? Hero, villain, or something in between? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want more deep dives into revolutionary history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.